of time and being at the very last session of the day. In the interest of traffic and fun, as we all are ready to leave, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. This is Exploring Utah's Multicultural Past Through Oral History. I'm Jodi Graham. I work at Utah Humanities. I run the grants and the outreach for Utah Humanities. And the three panelists we have today have one really awesome thing in common. They've all received an oral history grant from Utah Humanities and the Division of State History. We offer an oral history grant together, which is a really cool thing. Back in the day, they were doing one, we were doing one, and we said, hey, this is silly, why don't we do this together? So even have someone apply for one from history and then come back and apply from us for the very same project. So we consolidated, and it's been probably my favorite grant line. Not that we're allowed to have favorites, but it kind of is. I'd just like to introduce the panelists to you, and we'll just kind of let them go in order, and then at the end we'll have some question and answer, if that's okay. First up, we will have Randy Williams. Her project is the Cache Valley Refugee Voices. Randy is the Fife Folklore Archives Curator and Oral History Specialist at Utah State in the Special Collections and Archives. She has even won a Human Ties Award from Utah Humanities for a project that she did. I had 2009. Your picture said 2008 in your last presentation, so I'm probably wrong. You probably have it correct. But she won an award, and it was very well deserved for a fantastic project. Next up, we will have Deborah George, who she has worked for the Internal Revenue Service, and she's worked in the Compliance and Human Resources Department. She works now with the New Zion Community Advocates, and that's a nonprofit grassroots group whose mission statement is to innovate, advance, and sustain community programs for affordable housing, social integration, youth development, heritage preservation, and quality of life. So good stuff for that. Hi, Megan. And finally, we have Sarah Singh, formerly known as Sarah Langston, now known as Sarah Singh. Sarah sings. I don't know if Sarah sings, but she's the Associate Curator of Special Collections at Weber State University, where I happen to have graduated from, so go Wildcats. She holds a master's degree from Utah State and also San Jose State University, and she has authored 3 books on the history of Ogden. She's been documenting the 25th Street area and its notorious, really colorful, really awesome past. I think listening to your oral histories that came in, my favorite quote from one of the projects was a gentleman who said, and then when the hookers left, it all went downhill. That was sort of my favorite piece from that. So we will just go ahead and get started. I'll turn it over to Randy Williams, and we'll just go from there. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Somebody's saying, are you okay? Just let me go first. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I just had a little water going in the side of my throat. Sorry. I'm from Las Vegas, and I couldn't help with the hooker stuff. It has absolutely nothing to do with my presentation. But a childhood friend of mine, and this is in another county of Nevada, when she was expecting her first baby, the ladies gave her a bridal shower. Stuff like that. Interesting things.
Well.
Let go of your perceptions, folks. This summer, I had the opportunity to participate in a culmination activity of about 4 years of work and hopes and interest. And it culminated in the Cache Valley Refugee Voices project. You might know that Utah is home to about 45,000 refugees with about 53 languages and from about 20 countries. And these are some of those countries in the state of Utah. Salt Lake City is a refugee center where people, when they get refugee status, are sent in various places throughout the United States, and you might know that Salt Lake City is one of those centers. Cache Valley is not a resettlement community. However, people, all of us, how many people in this room live in the same place that they were born? one person, two people in this room. We move around. I mean, all of us, we move around. Well, that's the case also with, refugees. And so, Cache Valley right now is home to about 300 refugees from 8 different countries. And you'll notice that some of these countries are similar to the countries that I mentioned for the state of Utah, and mostly in Salt Lake County, but also other counties. In 2014, starting 2013, 2014, Utah State University worked with Workforce Services to do a statewide assessment to find out what were the needs of refugees in Utah. And that project was really rewarding. We worked with students in sociology with Jess Lucero's class to train our students to do some assessments, and they were sociology and social work students. There was about 50 of them, and different of us did different trainings to help them, and then they interacted with caseworkers and providers and religious leaders to ask, how do you interact with the refugee communities in your community? And I'm using community and community twice because there's refugee communities in a community that they move to. And then there was actually the interviews with the refugees themselves, finding out about the services that were provided. And that was a project funded, as I said, by Workforce Services. And it was a funded project to find out a need, and then a needs assessment, and then try to maybe alter the way people interact, different kinds of outcomes. But that wasn't an oral history project. So let me step back a couple of years. Many of you, well, maybe none of you. I'm used to talking to folklore, so of course everybody in that room would know. Besides Adrian and I, you might not know a woman named Nelda Alt. Nelda Alt, a few of you in this room?
Nelda used to work for us at Utah Humanities.
Well, Nelda is an amazing woman, and she was a student at Utah State University, and then went and got a master's degree in public folklore. And while she was, I'm sorry, no worries. While she was getting her degree in Kentucky, she worked for a refugee resettlement group. And that, like all of us, different things get on our radar in different ways. And when she came back to Utah State, or the state of Utah, and up to Logan, Utah, where she's, came back home to where her family was at, she had opportunities to work through a variety of ways, including Workforce Services, with communities, refugee communities. And at that point, and this is several years back, about 4, Nelda and I, both folklorists, started working together, saying we need to do an oral history project with the refugee community in Cache Valley. But, when you're trying to get a job and get an apartment and get your kids in school, and you're trying to do a lot of stuff, really taking the time to be interviewed by somebody is a little bit lower on your priority list. And we kept saying it's not time, it's not yet. And Nelda parlayed her efforts into a nonprofit, and I'll show you a slide in a moment. Actually, I'll show it to you right now. Here's one of the slides from the Cache Refugee and Immigrant Connection. And there's a small group of folks in Cache Valley that work to do the kinds of things that people in Salt Lake County are doing with folks that are resettled. Like helping people, if you move to a new place and you get, junk mail, it says urgent. Like I don't know, but when I was, my youngest is 28, but when he was about 5 or 6, about once a month I get a phone call at work when he would get home with his sisters from that hour before I got home, and he'd call me and say, "Mom, we have won $1 million." Honestly, that kid called me numerous times when we get those Reader Digest, those things in the mail, because as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, he could read, but he couldn't interpret what was happening. So envision you get to a new country and you get something in the mail that's, you've got your 8-year-old interpreting for you, and you're not quite sure how to do it. So something might seem as basic as having someone read your mail and help you to determine what is junk mail and what isn't junk mail. So Nelda's organization was providing a variety of services, from citizenship training to filling out papers to helping, with interpretation and a variety of things. So when the Workforce Services opportunity came, we all jumped on it, and there was an amazing woman, Lorian Belton, who was a PI and worked through Scott Daniels in sociology at USU. Steve Daniels, excuse me. So in Cache Valley, then, to set the stage, we have a, not 58,000, but we have, because remember back here, we are 45,000, but we have, 300, a smaller group. But that voice is part of what I want to capture as part of Northern Utah Speaks, which is the Oral History Project initiative at Utah State University. So here are some of the communities that are in Cache Valley right now. A small number in the schools. So what brings some of the refugees from their home countries are a variety of things, but I think probably everybody in this room knows, if we're listening to the news, if we were to just stop right now and get your phone out and Google, you could find any number of articles right this instant about a refugee in the world that, from folks trying to move from Syria through up into in Italy and Hungary and trying to get, from France over to the UK or various places. So we know that distress makes people move from their home country, where most people would rather be. I mean, most, if you talk to most refugees, that's where they would prefer to be. But for a variety of reasons, they move. And they get, not everyone gets refugee status, but those who do, then they get placed in a country, a host country, and there's host cities in the countries, and Salt Lake City is one of those hosts. Cache Valley becomes then a place that people migrate or move to for a variety of reasons. And occupation is one of them. And in Cache Valley, and interestingly, Maria Luisa and I just talked about the Latino Voices Project just like 2 minutes ago in the same room. One of the reasons that right now employment is a large reason people move. All of us, people move for, lots and lots of us move for work. But a lot of folks in the refugee communities move to Cache Valley because of the Swift meatpacking plant. How does that happen? How do people find out about that? Well, it's word of mouth. And so slowly and gradually, someone in Salt Lake County says, I got a job that pays a lot more than any of the jobs around here, and it's just, 80 miles. And so one family moves, or one person moves, and then, other people, word of mouth, and as some of the Latino employees at Swift Meatpacking Plant move up in the firm or move over to another occupation, then it opened a gap, and that's where a lot of the refugee families, especially the fathers, work. This is a couple-year-old, I think about 18-month-old slide, but it shows you the children or the youths where they might be going to school. These are all schools in Cache Valley. Now that I'll just mention worked, she went from the job that she had working with Vista Volunteer and then also working with Workforce Services to working at Wilson Elementary. So she's a key contact in Cache Valley, and we're working with Nelda. So now that I have this dream, and this is a 4-year-old dream, and to make sure we're capturing the voices, because many refugees, and if you're familiar, like with the fall of Saigon and with the end of the Vietnam War, there were refugees at that time coming in. Hmong refugees, Vietnamese refugees, Laotian refugees, but Hmong refugees were coming into Utah at the time, and I know you probably have had oral histories. I mean, that in Ogden and down in with a mushroom farm down in
Fillmore?
Thank you, Fillmore. A lot of Hmong families were working there. But, refugee migration continues. That's just something because of the nature of the world we all live in. So we wanted to make sure we captured the voices of the people here now, because maybe in 10 months or a year or 3 years, maybe folks will be establish themselves somewhere else. Because like with the Hmong community, a lot of folks are now like in Sacramento or in Minnesota and other places that they resettle to. Adrian's shaking her head because it's folklorist. A lot of times we're working with the traditional artists in these communities. And so, a lot of us like to move where families are. And that's just what we do. And so when a lot of people are in an area, so we wanted to make sure we captured these voices. And so this summer we were able to do so. We partnered with the Library of Congress, Nelda and Lisa Gabbert, who is a director of the folklore program at Utah State University. We partnered with the refugee community. This is Chimo. He is from Burma, Myanmar. You might think of it as, who like now is was born in Burma. He's Korean. He is an ethnic community, a smaller ethnic community that's having some ethnic cleansing by Myanmar government. So for years there's been outgrowth into Thailand. So he spent most of his, from a really young child till he was about 13 in a Thai refugee camp. This is Tom Williams, and Tom interviewed Chimo and I about the project. So we partnered with the refugee community, hired Chimo, and worked with Nell and other people in the community to decide how to get this project going. We worked with the Cash Refugee Immigrant Connection CRIC, Nella's organization, as well as the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, who helped us with the training, the English department, of course, the wonderful funders of our project, the Utah Humanities Council and Utah Division of State History. But you can't do projects without money, and you can't do projects without people's support. Now, the first support I feel, this is just my own philosophy, but I feel like you really don't do a project without the support of the community. That doesn't work well. You can't think of an idea unless the community that you're thinking it up has a high buy-in. And not just a buy-in, hey, can we do it, but a buy-in, will you help us do it? How should we do it? Look at these questions. Let's formulate questions. Let's formulate ideas. So working with Chimo. And so then, here's this young man that about 5 years ago was living in a refugee camp in Thailand, is now working, like many youth, in migrant. We've seen it in the Latino Project, we've seen it in the Refugee Project. Many times the voices, the interpreters, are the young people for our community for the first generation, sometimes second generation. So Chimo is a 20-year-old Utah State University student studying computer science. He also works for me in the Fife Book Archives, and probably, well, maybe not now, but maybe right now he's in there sorting genre collections, folklore, jokes and legends and stuff, and quilts. He went through a whole thing of quilts. And I thought, how interesting culturally for this boy that lived in Burma, then in Thailand, and now in Cache Valley, and for a short stop in Salt Lake City, is sitting here looking at the difference between a log cabin quilt, and he's really good at it, let me tell you. But he did this really great interview on the radio talking about our project. And so getting the word out about what we're doing in the big community and the smaller refugee community. So the field school was an upper division, but also a lower division. We had 9 students, 1 undergrad and the rest graduate students that participated in this cultural training. That the main goal was to document, it was to train field workers, these are folklorist graduate students, on hands-on ethnographic training. The focus was gather the stories of new refugees in Cache Valley, because we have had older refugees who came from other waves of conflict. But we chose 3, even though I showed you that we have more refugee communities. And that was through that workforce services project that I worked with. And so as I was doing that, we weren't able to gather that data, because that was data that they were trying to figure out how to better meet the needs of the refugees. And their IRB precluded us from gathering the stories. But my IRB, Institutional Review Board, allowed us to keep the stories. We chose to work with the Burmese Muslim. That's a self-designated term. They're not Rohingyan, although that might be what you think of when you hear Burmese Muslim. But they are from Burma. They're a Muslim community, and they're a smaller community. The Korean community is a little bit bigger, but there was about 8 families. Just FYI, many of them have now moved. And just in a short time they were all kind of preparing to move, and a lot of them have moved. The Korean community also from Burma, and then the Eritrean community from Eritrea. Most of them are all men. And we also worked with an Iranian family, wondering if they might, that group is smaller, it's a couple of families, but they are concerned because sometimes they actually go home. And many times you hear in the news about people coming back and being detained. They're fearful about, and they are, their religion is what is the rub for them in Iran. So we're focusing on the documentation of this cultural resource and the preservation of documentary materials. We would do some public presentations with our students, and I'll show you a little bit about that. The instruction for our students would cover areas such as research ethics. Spent a lot of time with that, huge amount of time. Ethics, power relationships, and the struggles that, I just look like a, regular person, but I also, part of my title, you saw Utah State University, which may not mean anything to anybody, but sometimes those titles can mean something. And, those power relationships, talking about that. Learning how to interview, learning about equipment, just as basic as that. Observation techniques, and also transcription, which we received great funding. Because we do this in a less than a month period, and so our students could transcribe a little bit, but they couldn't transcribe everything. And we need to give back what we've done to the community, let them review it and vet it before we include it. And so, field note writing. This whole idea was giving the students an opportunity to learn how to do this kind of work, but also make a collection available so the voices were not lost, and making sure we created the metadata, and making sure that we made these exhibits that made it available not just to anybody that came to the university, because you might be familiar with the university. I go there every day. I've been working there for almost 22 years. But if that's not part of your worldview, if you've not come up to a campus before, coming to find a special collections, finding a parking spot on campuses is, So we need to make it digitally available so somebody can access their own voice, show their family member. Interestingly, that's why the Iranian community chose not to participate, because they didn't want their voice and their image. Even if we were to do some pseudonyms, they're like, not yet. We can't, that can't happen. And that's right. We making sure somebody's safety. We also did all kinds of interesting things, from lectures to hands-on activities, discussions, fieldwork, team community work. So here's the university faculty. Lisa Gabbard, right here, going forward. This is my husband. He was just with us that night. Guha Shankar from Library of Congress, and myself, and then Maggie Kuzi from Library of Congress. So that was the core team, the four of us, teaching the graduate students. And Lisa and I were also students. I've done hundreds of interviews, but it was great to have these peers of mine who are incredible field workers and have taught field schools all over the nation come and be our mentors as teachers, but also mentors for our students. Then we had community trainers, which actually probably to me were the more important trainers for this. This is where we got training on community mores and cultural taboos and what have you. And so we had Habiba up here from the Burmese Muslim community. And just a little interesting, our lunchtime presenter, Pam, was so rocking. That was so good. I was like, whoa, I'm in awe. Habiba, so let's just talk about this, a little bit about statistics and about, not necessarily census, but about naming. So you find out your family is going to become a refugee and you have been granted that status, and it is a status. And then somebody comes to you and wants to write your name down. But your language might not be a written language. And so somebody asked her name, and they said Habiba. So Harbi Bar is her birth certificate. Now, I don't know, but a lot of the folks from Myanmar and Burma, it's a one name. It's just your name is, like Chimo's name is Chimo. It's not Mr. Mo. Hey, Chi, how you doing? It's Chimo. It's just one word, that's his name. But it's spelled C-H-I-T space M-O-E because it fit the form that we, coming to the refugee camp are filling out. So Habiba is now Harbi Bar. And that's her legal name. So her, do you see where I'm going with this? Some changes that, can be affected on people. So here's one of our trainers, Habiba. And now we have Bahani. And Bahani is the exception to the rule. He is not a refugee, although he is from Eritrea. He is from a more middle-class family, and his family could afford to send him to university. He's actually at the University of Utah getting an engineering degree. He just started like 3-4 weeks ago. He's been teaching English to the Eritrean community. He's been working at Swift Meat Packing Plant also with another gentleman, saving money. But he himself is not a refugee, but he was a community scholar and a trainer. And Chimo, who now works in the Faifogla Archives, was our community access person, as well as these others. And then, of course, the students in the project. I didn't know if we would have good Wi-Fi, and they told me probably not, so I just built a project, or a PowerPoint around our project. So if you were interested, you could go and at Utah State's in our digital collection actually see the 3 exhibits that the students created. So these are just a few slides from the exhibit. So out of our work, we created, with the Burmese Muslim community, we interviewed 6 people. And I want to step back for a moment before I go any further and say, I don't know if it's a disclaimer or what, but if you're going to do a field school, you could do a lot easier than with a refugee community, because there's the reason I say that is because there's a language situation and a cost situation with interpreters. We started to use ComGap interpretive services, which we used for the previous workforce services, but okay, that was like us taking down information, blah, 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 then having the person they'd interpret it and give it back, and we're writing it down for the assessment. But anybody in here do oral history work? Okay, when you're doing oral history, well, you have to.
Well, yeah, but no, that way.
Our way.
Yeah, our way.
When you're doing oral history work and you're here and I'm interviewing somebody and I've got a microphone, and then you've got a phone that's sitting there being the interpreter, so I ask you a question, do I look at you or the phone? Well, of course I'm going to look at you, but the phone's going to tell you okay. That all of a sudden was just not going to work. So we had the scholars from the community be the interpreters. So then in any interview setting would be 3 students from the university, plus the interpreter, 4 people coming into your home. Hello, 1 of you and 4 of us. Okay, the dynamic's already weird. So what I say is this project that Nelda and I had been wanting to do, we probably could have decided to do something amazing and wonderful, like interview people about their barns in English. And I love barns as much as the next person. I love them. They have been done in Cache Valley by Lisa and Gady the Great. But we just said, you know what? No, we need to do this project. This is important stuff. There's going to be some crazy situations that come up, but everybody, was willing to try it, including the community. So, all of these, when you look at this transcript, you're going to see the interviewer saying something, the interpreter saying something, the interviewee saying something. So it's all the English is what we've got now up for you. We have full transcripts, audio, images, in the digital collection, and then we have a physical collection, and then we have an exhibit. And each of these groups, the Burmese Muslim group, and these are the field workers for that. It includes in their exhibit things like maps, and it includes information about that community. And you can see all of the exhibit information right here. And you can jump to each of those in the exhibit. And then it talks about a person. It gives you background information about Habiba, about leaving Burma, about where she came from, about finding out, and this is her words to you. She with her little brother Mong putting on Tanaka, which is a beauty product. It's also like a suntan screen, but it's also beautiful designs. If you've ever seen Tanaka applied, it's incredible. We had the Korean community, the same things, the same deliverables. We had 3 field workers, and then, they introduce you to things like refugee camps. Again, the exhibit you could go to and see and find out about about her family. And these are just snippets from, the interview. From the Eritrean community, again, the materials. Again, information about that community that the students have created. And Aforki, who we worked with the assessment project, but also the students went back and interviewed. And so these are online. You can go and see the exhibits right now. You can read the transcripts. That's all available to you. The graciousness of the people in the community who are working. Aforki works at hours and hours, and so at the end of the day, he's exhausted, but he was willing to participate, as were all of the folks. We had a great team of students, and the collection is a powerful record, small but powerful record about the refugees in Cache Valley right now. And we hope to add to it. We hope to continue this project. And it might be, over years of inclusion of different communities that are coming into our valley. And I do want to thank the Humanities Council for their wonderful support. So,
And we'll save questions till the end if that's okay.
Okay.
Everybody, if that's all right.
I'm not going to interrupt you again, okay, with my voice. I'm sorry.
I'm done so much.
I was
with
looking
that
for some
stuff.
food for her.
That's mine.
I'm not gonna-
So yeah, minimize it.
Thank you. Good afternoon, my name is Deborah, and I'm here representing the New Zion Community Advocates, and we had an oral history project, and our project dealt with interviewing African American members age 80 and over to get their historical perspective of when they first came to the Ogden area and what they experienced and what they saw and how they lived. And so the biggest obstacle to my project was getting the people to talk. They didn't think they had anything to share. They were saying, what could I possibly share? What would be interesting to people? But as they told their story, they were so interconnected. You know, they either knew each other through church or through civil rights activities that they participated in. And also, they also talked about, you know, how African American businesses sprung up because of the need, because they weren't able to go to other stores in the Ogden area because of segregation at that time. And they created their own social and civil clubs, civic clubs, to have an outlet to socialize. Because again, there was segregation there. So one of the long-term impacts is just being able to have that history. It's located at the Utah History and also at Utah Humanities Council. They also have a copy of it. But my partner in crime, I call Sarah Singh, because at the time when I first applied for the grant, she was working on the 25th Street, and they kind of dovetailed. And so I was really fortunate, and they were so instrumental in providing equipment, transcription of all those oral histories. We did 12 of them. And I just think it's so important because, you know, people will just assume things or just say, oh, you know, okay, they were here. What did they do? And so hopefully this is just a small beginning of other stories that we can capture. So at this time, I have an 18-minute DVD, and I think the best way is just to let you hear some of the stories that they told to myself and other interviewers. So with that, we'll see if we can get that started.
Oh, where did it go?
I think you need to click on it.
So the unknown DVD.
Thank you. Let's take a look at that.
It's too loud or not loud enough. Shout out was wrong.
Did those incidents really propel you into the civil rights activism, or was that something you sort of already had as a result of Jimmy's involvement with NAACP and et cetera? Was that kind of your early entry into Ogden branch NAACP activism?
Not really, because we jumped over one thing. That was when I was in the youth group.
Okay.
And that was when Lauren Farr Park would not let black people swim in the swimming pool. And so we went to the Ogden City Council about it, and they just couldn't believe it, and they wouldn't believe it. And some people were crazy enough to say, well, why don't we build a swimming pool down here? Well, at that time, black people were like 0.1% of the population. They weren't going to build any swimming pool for us and all that. And this is important, and I just forgot to tell you about it. They couldn't believe it. And I took my swimming pool, and as I said, I've always been little, and I got my swimming suit and put it over my shoulder, and they said, well, you can't go out there by yourself. So they sent Marion Carter and Frank Satterwine to go with me. And you know, Marion's real tall.
Yes.
And big. And we went out there, and sure enough, they would not let us swim, not let me, I was the only person, swim in the swimming pool. And we came back, and the press got all involved, and see, we still, and of course people didn't know the FBI was watching everything. Only we knew that. And so we came down, and of course that stirred a lot of interest in the newspaper. And it was all in the paper. And guess who said they can come and swim at our swimming pool? We were straight.
So what did you all do for fun?
What did we do for fun? Back in those days, there wasn't very much for blacks to do. We had to make our own entertainment and do our own socializing, you know. And they had a lot of house parties at that time, and that's what people did. And later on, in I guess it was back in the late 50s and early 60s, then they start doing society clubs and things like that, you know.
Particular society?
I'm picking up that envelope on top of it. They had such clubs like,
Oh, you got
I have pictures here, if you want to look at those, of one of the clubs. This is a book that we did, and one of my clubs did, of
Scan these in?
different people, different organizations.
What do you miss about the way it used to be? Is there anything that you miss?
Yeah, I miss places we used to go and, you know, and enjoy ourselves. They just, like the Elks Club in Salt Lake is there no more. The American Legion is not there anymore. Sloppy Joe's is not there anymore. The Disco Lounge is not there anymore. Only place that's left there now is Willie Morton's barber shop. But that's the only black place they had. That's a barber shop. And so you know where to go. You don't want to go there because you get your hair cut, you're gone.
So do you remember any some characters from around Ogden? You know, people that, you know, that were kind of a flash that you thought, oh wow. Not really, no, you don't remember any of the great characters from here. Okay.
We used to have a center on Wall Avenue, they called the Wall Avenue Community Center. We used to have dance and things and games, so that changed.
I used to live about half a block from there.
Yeah, you remember that?
I do. Well, I'm 20, just a little off place there. Sure do. Okay.
As you look back over your life, what lessons do you think you've learned through all of this? You know, leaving Mississippi, coming out here to Utah, and Utah's been your home for quite a while.
You know, I learned, this is what I learned. I learned that people are the same everywhere you go. Everywhere you move, I don't care where town you're in or where you go, you're gonna find good people, you're gonna find bad people. I would say, I don't want to say bad, but that's what they are. But I want to say people who don't know any better, not the way they act. They think that's really the way you're supposed to act, but it's not. Kindness rule the world. But everywhere you go, I learned that it's the same everywhere you go. Pretty soon you're gonna find the same situation. You got good people over here, wonderful people over here, and you got this little Satans over here. Just like a bunch of crawfish. I'm down here, I want you to be down here with me, you know. But everybody needs to have their own personality and their own strength to make it in this world. You can't live for nobody else but your own. And then know what you want and go after it, you know. That was my philosophy. And I heard my kids, I told my kids, you know what you want to be. I work toward that goal. And be all that you can be in that project. And don't care what job you're on, it's not going to be a bed of roses. It's going to be problems on every job you get on. It's going to be problems. But you learn to cope with them with humility. You know, I just believe that love and humility just goes hand in hand, and you can move mountains with that.
About who are some of the great characters from here, and you wrote down Reverend Washington.
Yeah.
Pastor.
Yeah.
Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah. He was a military man, and besides being a preacher, now I don't know his history beyond he was in Wyoming, and he was even a chaplain there. He got to be an assistant chaplain or a chaplain there in Wyoming, you know. And he was from the South, you know. He was, and he had the mind of building churches, you know. And I don't know what his educational thing is other than a pastor, you know, one of those things. But he had a way of getting people to follow him or work with him, you know. And because when he built this church here, you know, we had very little money in the treasury. But by the time we bought this ground and this parsonage here, there was no building fund at all. You know, there was no building fund. And there were people from Wyoming that came here to help him to build this church here, you know. And he had a way with people, you know. And what he would do, I noticed him, I observed him, when he would come around and they were building this, he would never be dressed. He'd never be dressed. He would be dressed in work clothes. He'd have his gloves, you know, and that's a sign that you're going to go to work. He had work gloves. A lot of times he'd have them in his hand, and what he's going to do, you know. And he'd come out and he was, people would work for him, you know, on those things. So I thought that was a technique, you know, instead of just getting up blasting, telling them about what we need and put the money, bring the money, and all that kind of thing. You know, he came out and showed that he would.
You must have a dirt smudge there. Technical difficulties.
Plan B.
Yeah, Plan B.
Do you want me to turn on the lights?
Yes, turn on the lights. For some reason, it's sticking.
He would get in and work with you. He would get in and do the dirty work. He would get in and get dirty. You know, one of those things.
No, it's gonna skip on us. So that's just a snapshot of some of the things. There were other people that we talked to. One lady in particular, her name was. Her name was, and I'm drawing a blank. Isn't that awful? But anyway, she had an experience where she was working again with the youth NAACP. And they were trying to get restaurants on 25th Street to serve them. And so there was a group of them, and half went on one side of the street, another went on the other half of the street. And so they would go to the restaurant door and they said, sorry, we don't serve you. Sorry, we don't serve you. Well, finally she got to a place where there was someone that would serve them. But the person that had the money was across on the other side of the street. So she had to run over there to get money so that they could pay for the food they were being served. So those were some of the things they did. Another individual shared a story about how she rode the Bamberger trolley. I don't know if y'all are aware of the Bamberger trolley. And one day she took her daughter. She left from, I believe it was Clearfield, to go to Ogden to go shopping. And as she was coming back home, there were some people on the trolley that were giving her and her daughter a hard time. And it really frightened her, she didn't know what was going to happen, because they were bullying her, saying, why are you on this bus, and why are you here, why do you people come here? It was just antagonizing. And she said, I remember this so vividly. The bus driver or the trolley driver said, because she was sitting right behind him, he said, ma'am, at the next stop, I'm going to let you off so that you can get off, you and your daughter can get off safely, and then I'm going to pull off. And so he did do that. And so the people that were harassing her said, wait a minute, let us get off. But he kept driving. And she still remembers to this day that act of kindness. So as the lady said on our DVD, there are good people and there are bad people everywhere. And so those were just some of the stories that they shared. Another incident was that one lady was able to hire on to the IRS, and at that time it was not popular for African Americans to work at IRS, and they tried to kind of pigeonhole you in certain positions, but she rose above that, and as she was rising in her rank, she always would help other people to go along with her and help them achieve what they could in their careers. And so she was a mentor to many, many people, and she's so humble and modest, she would never admit that, but she helped a lot of people in her career. Some of the things that I learned through those interviews were, number one was the Royal Hotel was the only place that African American people could stay when they first came into the state to work on the railroad, either as cooks or Pullman porters, laborers, maids in homes and things. The other thing was that we could not buy real estate above Washington Boulevard in Ogden. Could only,
even if you had the money.
Even if you had the money. There was certain areas that they would show you homes in, and those were the only areas you were allowed to buy in. And another thing, and I'm sure Sarah will touch on this in her presentation, the south side of 25th Street, I believe, was the only side that we were allowed to shop on. Whereas everyone else could go either side, we were limited to the south side. And again, I had mentioned earlier that African American owned businesses, they were started to meet the needs because they were not able to access all the other services that were in the city at that time. And the social clubs and the civic clubs, that was their outlet. Besides church meetings and worshiping, that was their only other outlet for fun, for dancing, just for casual talking and catching up and just talking with one another. Those were the only things that they had. And so this was really an enlightening thing for me. I was raised in Ogden. Ogden is all I know. That is home for me. But these were some facts that I did not know. And what is interesting is that we had 12 people designated to interview. Prior to one interview, we lost one of our interviewees. And after the project was completed, we lost 2 more. So it's so important to get those histories, oral histories down. And this is a small beginning, but it's opened up so many doors for our organization, Design Community Advocates. In May of this year, we did a historical photo gallery highlighting the 1940s and 60s. And that was very interesting to see all of the Black-owned businesses that are no longer here. The civic clubs, social clubs, they're no longer here. And also looking at how the early African American churches developed. And there were some historical photographs of those from the Ogden area. Then in June, we've begun working with the Ogden Union Station. They're going to create an exhibit focusing on the significant role of the Pullman porters that they played in the railroad in Ogden and the American West. And so we've been asked to partner with them. So without the funding from Utah Humanities Council, Utah State History, and especially it helps when you have a university located in your town when you're doing oral histories, because they got all the equipment you would ever need. And if you can get the grant to get the money so that they can do that, it makes it so much smoother. And then the other thing we've got coming up February in Ogden is we're going to be showing a independent film that some Salt Lake Community College students have created called Civil Rights in Utah, and we're going to host that for them in the Ogden area. So that'll be really interesting. And so Our future goal for the New Zion Community Advocates is we'd like to see a Black History Museum in Ogden to kind of catalog and showcase all these stories and piece them together. So we're always looking for journals and pictures and memorabilia. So if you know anybody or if you have something, we'd be more than happy to help you to take that off your hands. And so I do have some brochures about our organization and also some brochures about the project that we did that will show the names of the individuals that we interviewed. And if you're interested in that, I can provide that later on. So thank you for your attention.
All right, so now we save the seedy side of life in Utah. Because okay, how many of you know about 25th Street? You know?
Oh yeah.
All right. My favorite legend of 25th Street is that Al Capone once came in on the train, walked down 25th Street, and turned around and walked back and got back on the train because Ogden was too rough of a town for him. You know, so that kind of sets the stage of what 25th Street was like from the early 1860s, 70s, really up until current times. I mean,
Really?
oh yeah, it had its time. And, you know, there were times in the 70s where you would not want to be down on 25th Street. It was not a place of anybody wanted to be, but now it's revitalized and it is very much a center of Ogden, and that's where all the local businesses are and great restaurants and things. So what had happened is we were talking about 25th Street and sort of some of the things, and I said, you know, it's really interesting that not much has been documented about 25th Street from World War II on. So there's lots of the earlier stuff when you talk about some of the early prostitution, the opium dens, bootlegging, things like that. But not a whole lot was done. And of course with the railroad, during World War II, there were thousands of servicemen coming in through Ogden every day. And I said, this seems like a perfect time to start documenting that. So this is just some of my favorite. We interviewed well over 50 people for this project. From people who lived down there, worked down there, had memories. I mean, we had everything from people telling us their Friday nights used to be going down on 25th Street, parking, rolling up your windows, locking the doors, and then watching. And you would watch the drunks stumble out of the bars, and you'd watch fights, you'd watch the prostitutes up in the, you know, their cribs, waving down, watching. But that was a Saturday night or a Friday night for you, so. All right. Okay, we'll just do it this way. So this gentleman here is Ed Murphy. Ed's family actually owned the lower 100 block south side, so of 25th Street. They owned a little antique store there, and when we interviewed him, he says, I remember the stores on 25th Street with their particular odors. You'd go into a bakery and you'd smell the wonderful odor of fresh bread. You'd go into Kay's Pharmacy, which was across the street, and a part of the hotel, and you'd smell the spicy smell of botanicals. You'd go into my grandfather's store and smell the peculiar odor of tanned buckskin. You'd go into other stores where people lived in the rear of them, and you would smell their cooking, which sometimes was not very nice, but today it's different. So, never wants to work for me. This is Joe Prantill. Joe's grandparents owned a confectionery, which was a soda shop, on the 200 block south side. So it's the side. And so he talks about his grandfather. Now this was during bootlegging. Okay? So he says, Dad tells me that since grandfather was a stonemason from Italy, he built a false wall in the basement and put a tank behind the wall. They had plumbed the tank up to the faucets of the sink in the bathroom. And there they had valves that if you turned the water faucet, booze would flow out. But you could also turn the other faucet and water would come out depending on who was going, you know. So it was a way for them to hide the liquor during Prohibition. So this is actually his grandfather inside his store. So this is Lewbert. Lewbert was a police officer on 25th Street. So you can imagine some of the things he talks about. So he says, I can tell you a lot of crazy stories about what happened when I patrolled 25th Street. I was involved in the, quote, cleaning up of the houses of ill fame. Sometimes we would just sit in the main lobbies of some of the businesses to cut down on the business. But a lot of the people that frequent those businesses would hear that we were sitting there, and they'd sneak in and out of the back. One night, we arrested 35 people in a particular cat house. The madam would always try to give the on-duty officers cake, coffee, or liquor. I always refused. I told her, I don't drink coffee, I don't drink liquor, and I am skeptical on who made that cake. So, and then he goes on and he says, we arrested a madam one time, and we're booking her in jail. She had rings on all her fingers, and jewelry that she was wearing was documented at $40,000 alone. She was worried that she would not get all of her jewelry back when she was released. I assured her she would, and we put it all in an envelope, sealed it, and she wrote her name along it. That way she would know if the signature had been disturbed, the jewelry had been tampered with. When she was released, the signature on her envelope was just as she'd written it, and her jewelry was intact. And he says, after we cleaned up a particular group, they headed off either to Reno or Las Vegas because prostitution was legal there. So this is Don Garson. Don's father was the head of anti-vice in Ogden during the 50s and 60s. So he talked about his dad going on a lot of raids for things. So of course with anti-vice, they were not only trying to get prostitution, but also illegal alcohol and gambling. And of course gambling was a big thing on 25th Street. He says they raided the Elks Lodge at one time because they had slot machines there. Bootleggers were a big problem because the state didn't like losing their tax money on booze. The bootleggers usually brought it in from out of state. He says, I remember, he said one time he was a patrolman, and on 25th Street, he went up the back stairway where he knew some gaming was going on. He was in uniform, so he turned his hat around so the badge wouldn't shine, and he watched them through the window. And there were a lot of guys in there that he knew. So he watched them for a while, and then he ran into them on the street a few days later and asked them how it would hurt to lose that much money. So this is his dad. And this, of course, is the famous Willie Morton, who was the barber on 25th Street. Unfortunately, he's no longer in Ogden. But Willie had a lot of great stories to tell. And, of course, my interest is prostitution in Ogden, so I picked this quote. He says, have you ever heard of the Rose Rooms? They were on the corner right over there, the Rose Rooms. Because men didn't bring their wives with them, that was a good place for them over there. It wasn't the only place. Rose was a lady, and she was smart. She made it a business. The business she would open at 8 and close at 5. When she closed, there was no men or women doing anything. Then she would open up at the back right the next morning. She had a Cadillac, a pink Cadillac. Now, if you're from Ogden, you remember Rose and her pink Cadillac, and her Ocelot. She had an Ocelot. She rode the Cadillac up and down the street with her dark shades on and a hat. And women didn't like her because she was working. You know, she was making money off of those women. So this is the Rose Rooms. What's incident is actually where Joe Prantill's, it was the same building that Joe Prantill's grandfather owned as well. It was turned into the Rose Rooms during the 50s. It is currently a wonderful bar called Alleged, and he has, when the gentleman bought it, there were still the brothel room doors in the building, so he's turned those into tabletops and the stalls for the bathroom. He has drinks named after some of the famous ladies, so there's a rose drink, and there's a fawn and a birdie and stuff like that, so it's kind of a fun little. So this is Rose, her mugshot, and then that is her husband, Bill. So this quote comes from L.G. Bingham, who was Rose's lawyer during the 1950s. Rose had been arrested, and she needed a lawyer and came to see me. She was a very beautiful woman and very posed and confident. She reminded me of Audrey Hepburn. She walked in like she was raised with a book on her head. She was a businesswoman. In fact, she kind of cowed to me. She came in and said, "I'm Rose Davy." I said, "Yeah, sit down. Most people call me LG." She said, "I'll call you Mr. Bingham, and you may call me Rose. I'm looking for a good lawyer. I have plenty of friends." She gave me a look. It wasn't a cold look. It was a look that said, "Mister, I'm hiring you to be a lawyer, and I understand you're a good one, and that's what I'm hiring you for." She had a look, not an unfriendly look, but you knew if you had a confrontation with her, she would win. She had a very powerful personality. And look by looking of her, she did. So this is Joe Liu. The interesting was is we talked to a lot of Japanese and Chinese because they grew up right around 25th Street. So he talks about being a kid on 25th Street. And he was about 10 or 12. And during the war, when servicemen would come walking up 25th Street, he would go up to him and he'd say, "Hey, mister, do you want to know where the girls are?" And of course, most of them would be like, "Yeah." So he says, "I would just go ahead and give them a room number to some hotel and take $1. And off they would go. And he says, of course, I had no idea whether a girl was at that door or not. He said it was a pretty good gig until they caught on, and then he had to stop doing it. So this is the China Temple. Joe Liu's family actually owned this. And so this was really interesting, talking about segregation, is that, so this was on the north side. Even though it was run by Chinese, they still wouldn't allow African Americans to come in and eat in this restaurant. And so they would have troubles, especially during the civil rights period, with people coming in and shooting out their windows and stuff because they wouldn't allow blacks to come in there. So this is the Porters and Waiters Club, and this was owned by Annabelle Weekly. It was, as Debbie talked about, the Royal Hotel was the one place that they could stay at. The Porters and Waiters Club was one place where they could go and have a drink, listen to some jazz, have a good time. And it was owned by Annabelle Weekly and her husband, Billy. This is Eric Zanger. He owns Great Harvest on 25th Street. And he just talked a little bit about his building, and he said, there was a lot of gaming equipment and illegal alcohol that was sold here. He said, I have a picture of when it was confiscated and all the stuff was laid out on the tables. So this is one of my favorite stories. This is Mike Schlosser, but we're going to skip to his grandfather. So his grandfather was a barber in the New Healy Hotel during World War II. So this is talking about with the soldiers. When it was time to get back on the train, because they didn't allow any alcohol on the train, the servicemen going to the war zone, and rules they figured didn't really apply to them. They learned through the grapevine that you could go up to the liquor store on 25th Street in Grant Avenue, buy half a bottle of whatever particular alcohol you wanted, go across the street to Sacco's fruit stand, and buy a small watermelon or large cantaloupe, then take it to my grandfather's barber shop. He would charge you $0.25 to go into his back room, hollow out the fruit, and stick your bottle of liquor inside so you could take it back on the train. And he says, my grandmother had so many stories about having to reinforce my grandfather's suit pockets because of all the weight of the change he brought home every day. My older sister vividly remembers him coming home, putting his hands in his pockets and just throwing change out on the floor. And as kids, we would dive into it. And he actually goes on to say that his grandfather made enough money doing this to buy their first car in cash. So this is Scott Van Leeuwen. He owns one of the pawn shops down on 25th Street, and he's one of the old timers. He's been down there for 60 plus years. So he was a great source of a lot of information. So here he is talking about Annabelle Weekly, and this is Annabelle. I knew Annabelle Weekly. She was a very popular girl who owned the place over across the street called the Porters and Waiters Club. She was a really dynamic kind of a girl and a mover and a shaker. And he says, I couldn't get into naming names and remembering names. Willie Morton was here forever, and Eddie Simone up the street in the Kokomo Club. These guys have been here and been long lifetime friends. I've known them for 50 or 60 years. I can't tell you how many good friendships have spawned from around here. So this is Dave Aoki, and he was one of the Japanese gentlemen that we interviewed, and he talked about sort of some of the Japanese stores that were located all along 25th Street. And he said, there are a few businesses. Tom Ochi's was a novelty shop, but the three main businesses were the Star Noodle, which if any of you have been to Ogden, the Dragon that was there is actually back.
Oh, it is?
It is. They just put it back last year. It's beautiful. Back on 25th Street. Utah Bamboo and Kay's Noodle Shop. And he talks about them bringing things in and boarding houses that are all along 25th Street. And then, of course, this is Shinji Yoshida, another one. So basically there was 25th Street, then off of 25th Street between Lincoln and Grant was what they called Japantown. And so this was where the Buddhist temple was and a lot of the Japanese businesses and dry food stores. He said there was a Chinese gambling casino on that block, and people say an opium den too, but I was never privy to that. I would imagine there was some of that stuff going on was pretty loose as far as gambling and stuff. The Lincoln Avenue between 24th and 25th was probably half a dozen Japanese restaurants and companies. On the west side, there was Pacific Fruit, which was a produce company, but it was primarily run by Japanese. So this is Kim, and Kim Bouchard represents the new generation of 25th Street. Her husband and her bought an old derelict building 20 years ago now and turned it into Roosters Brewing Company. So Roosters has been around for 20 plus years. She was one of the first businesses to come back onto 25th Street when they started the revitalization. So this is her talking about that. It was clear that this could be something, just because of the views and all of that. When you walk out of your car and you're leaving at 5 in the afternoon and the sun is setting, it's truly special. We were open to wanting to make Ogden a place for us and our boys. I was never going to come back to Ogden, but this was sort of a conscious decision of saying we want Ogden, we love 25th Street. The most remarkable thing probably is the changing of the guard that owned the buildings or businesses, the sense of an independent spirit. There's something special about that. It's hard because the buildings are old, the parking is tight, but this is a place for people to gather. The Union Station functions as an anchor of historic 25th Street, and it provides the heart of our city, and that's going away from a lot of other cities. It's really fun to see Ogden discovered through others' eyes, like out-of-towners' eyes, whether it's out of our own area, especially out of state. People from out of state love this area, and it's fun for me to see it just as they are starting to discover it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right, if I could have my three panelists just maybe join up here, and we're opening up for questions. Do we have any questions? Yes.
So I hate to make a comment before the question, but I just have thought I'm gonna do it anyway. This is the first time I've done it. I usually don't cave, but I'm an old Ogdener. My family's Ogdeners, and I just was laughing my heart the whole time because my grandma would go down and roll up her windows with her friends and watch the Pink Caddy and all the arrests until one night they witnessed a murder and then they went back.
Yep, that's
so. Anyways, it was just funny. But I did have two questions. Sorry, once again, I'm going to piggyback. One is, are you still doing oral histories on 25th Street, about 25th Street?
I'll just bring a couple chairs.
Or did the project kind of come to a close?
The project itself kind of come to a close. What happened was, as we were winding down, a large group of immigrant populations sort of popped up, and so that was what dovetailed off of it. So the previous session, my staff that's working on that talked about the Japanese, the Chinese, the Greek, Italian, and Dutch communities in Ogden. But we're always getting stories about 25th Street is so iconic in Ogden. You know, everybody who's been knows what 25th Street is. And so we're always getting stories, and people are always talking to us about 25th Street. The number one question I get asked are, were there tunnels under 25th Street? And my answer is no, there were not. You could, because the story was you could go down in the Union Station and come all the way up at the Ben Lomond Hotel 3 blocks up. And you could do all of that underground. And I said you could go, because all of the businesses were connected on the side of the street, so you could go from one end of the block to the other end, but you couldn't cross the streets. So.
I was going to say, if you're looking for someone, my great-grandpa was a deputy sheriff.
Who was your great-grandfather?
It would have been Winslow Farr. He was one of the deputies. So my grandpa has some pretty crazy stories. But anyways, so that was the first question. The second was actually for you.
Okay.
Regarding the African American population. So growing up in Ogden, I was aware of the history of the 25th Street and how it had been segregated, and of course more barbershop and everything. But I was curious as to how an African American community really came to Ogden in the first place. Was it primarily the railroad? Because it seems like a random place to end up in a civil rights movement in Utah.
Right. Some of them came from jobs from the railroad. Some came because they were in the service and they came here, liked it, and stayed. Some already had relatives here, you know, that had migrated here for education and job opportunities.
Okay. Interesting.
And most of them, like I say, were with the armed forces, and that's how they got here.
Thank you.
Debbie, I have a question for you. During your presentation, you mentioned some of the places where African Americans used to get together, and you said clubs, and you said church. What church?
There was the New Zion Baptist Church. There was also the Embry American Episcopalian, African American Episcopalian Church. There was also, I believe it's called Griffin Memorial Church of God in Christ. So those were the three main churches that initially started up here.
And are still
they are still active.
For people to get together.
They are still active. Plus a few more have sprung up since that time.
Yeah.
And the social clubs, they had some crazy names. Like there was one called the Esquire Club, and it was mainly for men. And then they had, you know, the Anytimers Club. That was a social club. They also had, they did, you know, socializing, but they also did some community work as well. So, yeah, it was just interesting how they, you know, said, well, if we can't do this, we'll create our own.
Yeah.
A question for Randy. So going through the field school and working on this project, would you say that, and again, I know you guys just finished it up this year, but would you say that's had some impact on changes to the archive's collecting practices, or how students are being roped in for future projects of this nature?
Well, you know, it's a great question, Adrian. We have always tried to have students participate in fieldwork. We've never done the archiving piece with the students. Usually the students come in and they're either doing an internship in the archives, or they're helping with an oral history project, but they're not doing both. And this time, and because they had to do both, and Sarah can help me out here a little bit, it's the idea, you know, when you're in the field gathering something, sometimes you're not thinking about how you're going to make it accessible. You're just getting something. And then later on, those people, me, Sarah, will deal with that. And so we had to have our students thinking about how to describe the metadata, which is the nerdy term of information about information. And I think that impacted us. And so one of the things we're doing is the Library of Congress and the American Folklore Society have created an ethnographic thesaurus, which is a tool to help describe cultural documents, cultural events. And so we are trying to, you know, is there any new language that we could add to the ethnographic thesaurus, the ET? And so we're kind of talking about that. And so for the next time in 2 years when we do another field school, I think we'll be better poised. I think the first time you do something, you do it and you do it okay, but you do it better the second time. And so having our students, we recognize that was a lot of work. So that was in 3 weeks. They met, you know, worked with the community, interviewed the community, transcribed some of it, created an exhibit, an online exhibit, and had to come up with metadata terms. it's just a lot of stuff. I mean, normally, when Sarah and I do this work, normally, I mean, like these projects take years.
Yeah.
I mean, like when I worked with the Latino community, this is my 9th year doing this, or with the ranchers, 3 years. So I'm talking 3 weeks. Even though the students did 3 weeks, I did, the 4 years beforehand, but still, that's the part they saw. So how can I give them the other 4-year part? So that's another thing. How do you do that? Because that's part of a job of a folklorist, to do that 4-year part. But, so there's a lot of lessons learned. I would do things a little bit differently, but I'm so proud of what the students created.
Well, I think working at a university, we have that option of pulling students in. I just did a huge project last semester with a public history class documenting the history of the Ogden stockyards. And so they went out and they did oral history interviews, they did historic research, they created an exhibit and a digital exhibit and things like that. And for me, being a historian, then an archivist, oral history, I mean, I wear 5 different hats. To be able to provide that resource and that opportunity for students is a great thing. For me to be able to say, you don't normally get this, but here, now's your chance to go out and do oral history interviews. Now's your chance to go out and collect historic materials and digitize them and catalog them, create metadata for it, and then put an exhibit up and see the culmination of all of that work. And so I always use students for all of my projects. I just think it's a great resource. Plus, I don't have time to go. I come up with the big ideas, but I don't have time to go out and do all of it myself. So it's nice to be able to pull students into it.
I did want to mention something, and I knew when I sat down there's something I forgot to add. I mentioned in one of the slides, and this kind of goes back to this idea of students and the takeaway. We had an evening event, and so that's kind of one of the beauties of working with the Humanities Council and the Utah Division of State History, is they kind of require you to do something to give back to the community. And I like that. I would probably do it anyway, but I like that that's built in.
Yeah.
We had an evening event. It was the day before the field school ended, and we were 3 weeks, and then the students had another few weeks to think about it and write a paper, the academic side, We had it in the Logan Library in a room that's about maybe half of this size. And we ran out of seats. It was standing room only, people sitting. And at the end of the night, Chimo said to me, I didn't think people cared that much about us. So that was a success to me. And the students, we've debriefed, all of us, and Chimo's been part of that debriefing, and it was just nice. I think the students took away this academic experience, but they took away this human experience. And in the American Folklore Society, and I think all of us, there's a piece that you do for your work, and then there's advocacy. And we are actually, 3 of the students in the field school and I are going to present at the American Folklore Society in a few weeks. And one of the things they're going to talk about is this new thing for them. How do you take something that you've learned and become an advocate? How does that work? How do you do that? I mean, it's a byproduct of having students involved and thinking through the work that we do.
Other questions?
Sarah, I was curious with the soldiers in World War II. Did the local law enforcement agencies get much help from the military in kind of enforcing what the soldiers?
No, they did not. Ogden during World War II, clear up until mid-50s, 60s, had a look the other way policy. The mayor at the time figured he could make more money taxing the things that went on than trying to stop it. And so my favorite quote from Rose Davey was, she saw herself as a real feminist and a real advocate for women, and she said, I would rather the soldiers come and bother my girls than the poor little Mormon girls walking up and down the street. She was an amazing person. She was just a fascinating woman. So they didn't, and it's interesting, we found, I was able to find some public health records from 20s up until 60s, and they talk a lot about how 25th Street is a breeding ground for all kinds of diseases, and you pretty much could go into any alley, car, or park and find a girl. So it was very profitable for these women, especially the madams, during that time, especially, you know, during the war when you just had hundreds. And bars, I mean, I think we counted one time that there were 98 bars on 25th Street. So so 25th Street is a 3-block. Okay, so that's like, it's a 3-block, and one side of one block is a park. And so that is like literally every other door was a bar. You know, so they could get at whatever they wanted.
And now?
There's still quite a few bars on 25th Street.
I need to go.
You need to go. You need to go and go to Alleged. Go have dinner at Roosters and then go to Alleged for a drink. They have a beautiful outdoor patio that you can watch the sunset, and plus then you can buy drinks called the Rose Davy, or the, you know, Harm Perry.
I have a question for Randy, and I know that I can ask her that, but what is the status of the refugees right now in northern Utah, in Cache Valley? What is the status? What is the next step?
So when you become a refugee, you get here and then you get a small amount of help from the refugee resettlement, you know, through workforce services. So I think it's about 3 months. So you might get an apartment, you know, help with resettlement and some in. But then you quickly need to get a job and get your children to school, and then you have, you know, the opportunity to apply for United States citizenship. So I'll just tell you, Chimo and his mom and dad, within the period of time since he's been working for me, which has been about 5 months, he and his mom and dad did go down and took the test, and Chimo and his father passed. His mother did not, but they have the opportunity to you know, go down and take the test again, and then it's a verbal test. And so it depends on, you know, it's kind of subjective, you know, who's interviewing you. But we just in Cache Valley in the last month had a Somali family. So I mean, it's an ongoing thing happening. It's not like, you know, somebody comes and then that's it. And then somebody might, like the Burmese Muslim community, they're mostly leaving to go to Michigan or other places where there's a larger community. So now the Somali family. And then with the Eritrean, it's mostly, because you know about Eritrea, you know, it's this conscription. I mean, the man, you know, like at 17, and then like the rest of your life, you're basically a slave. I mean, the rest of your life, basically, and it's very violent. So a lot of the men get into Ethiopia and marry Ethiopian women because of religion. They're Eastern Orthodox. Kind of like Eastern Orthodox Russian, but this is Eastern Orthodox, a little subset of that. So they're marrying Ethiopian women, because that's also the same religions, but the women will stay in Ethiopia and the men will come, so it's mostly men, but slowly their wives are coming with 2 and 3 children that are, you know, been in Ethiopia, so that demographic will change. So it's just a changing world, and every new family that comes has a new, you know, some of the same new needs.
Well, any other questions? Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you so much again to the panelists.